Okay, so if our panelists are ready, why don't we go ahead and get underway? It's just now a few minutes after the hour, and so want to thank our alumni and friends who joined us for today's panel discussion. I also want to thank our faculty and administrators who are also with us. My name is Chip Edmonds, and I serve as Executive Vice President. I'm here with my colleague, Amy Reyes, our Senior Director for Alumni Engagement. And we're very excited to join you today for, I would say, continuing the conversation around racial injustice and the challenges that are facing not only our country, but the world, and in particular, the Black Lives Matter movement that has been a part of our lives for now several years, and the nuances and changes in the character of that today. And in the spirit of a truly liberal arts institution, we believe in engaging around matters of importance across disciplines. And it's really at those intersections that we can begin to find new layers of truth and meaning and understanding around these important questions that are facing us as members of the human race. And so that's indeed what we have today. We have a whole range of faculty from our history department, our sociology department, from the Department of Education, and also in criminal justice. And so, and then we also have a member of the institution who is doing this work not only in her own research and past work, but also in her everyday life, in her leadership of students. And so with that brief introduction, the way we see this unfolding is that each of our panelists will offer a brief introduction that talks about their work and their involvement and their touch points on today's topic. And we then will invite each of you to submit questions and comments through the Q&A, and we will be eager to talk through those and address them together, and then through this just be in a really great dialogue and continue this important work together. So with that introduction, I will turn it over to Dr. Victoria Gonzalez from our Department of Sociology. Victoria, thanks for being with us.
Hello there. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really glad that I'm able to join this panel. I'm so excited to hear what everybody has to say. But just to speak a little to my relationship with Black Lives Matter, I wrote my dissertation on social movements, specifically online social movements. So, I recently graduated from Rutgers University, and over my years there, I started following a whole range of social movements, from Occupy to Black Lives Matter to even sort of small movements that a lot of people might not know of. And I was very interested at first about how Black Lives Matter came about, how it evolved from being a response to something that was happening in the legal realm to being something that suddenly became so visceral and present and active online. And I think that the evolution that we have really seen in people's passion and dedication to this movement over the last 7 years has shown a very interesting, I think, trajectory. It's been tracking a very interesting trajectory all along into our culture, into our popular culture, into our social imagination. And I think that that's been one of the most interesting things about this movement, right? It's Black Lives Matter, but it's more than that, right? We can take this movement and we can use it as an opportunity to teach about, humanity in all of its forms, and think about all of the various intersections of injustices that are occurring in our country at the moment. And I generally try and bring it up in every one of my classes, Black Lives Matter and other race and ethnic issues, not to mention the fact that I'm teaching race and ethnicity at Lycoming at the moment. And I think that, there are, as you said, there are many different ways of looking at it. I'm glad that we have a panel of people that are trying to take different lenses to interpreting and discussing, how important this movement is and the impact that it has on, the Lycoming community and beyond that. So I'm excited for the panel.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Rachel Hickoff-Cresco. I teach in the Department of Education. I've been at Lycoming College for 12 years. I focus a lot on literacy and teaching children whose first language is not English. So those are my areas of focus. Before coming to Lycoming, I spent 11 years teaching in a public school. And the district where I taught was a very large urban public school district. We had about 20,000 students, which is larger than a lot of our local districts here near Williamsport. Certainly not one of the largest districts in our country or anything. But we had, almost 100% of our students were considered to be economically disadvantaged based on their eligibility for free and reduced lunch. And about 95% of our students were students of color. We had, a large population of students who were English learners. So I think my experiences with that and my experiences in educating teachers, a few of my goals, I would say, would be to make sure that my teacher candidates are competent in advocating for students who come from underrepresented populations. That might be, I think all of my classes connect to the topic of Black Lives Matter. It might be through making sure our curriculum is not biased or not, whether explicitly biased or implicitly biased, making sure that our teaching pedagogy is not biased, making sure that our pedagogy supports all of our learners, and making sure our classroom environment and our classroom management and discipline practices are supportive of all of our students. So I will hand it over to Justin Lopez Medina.
All right, hi, good morning. Thanks for inviting me to be part of this panel, and thanks to all of the attendees. I look forward to this conversation as well. So my name is Justin Lopez Medina. I've been with the institution for this is my 6th year that I'm starting right now. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Criminal Justice Criminology. Before I went back to get my PhD, I was a practitioner in criminal justice. I was an adult probation officer in Philadelphia County. So I really approach so much of what I study from a complex systems kind of approach. The criminal justice system as we know it is really a series of discretionary points that make decisions about somebody's personal liberty. And these are important decisions and they deserve to be looked at closely. So I teach a number of different courses at Lycoming College, from policing and society to community-based corrections. I'm teaching an ethics course in criminal justice this semester. And I also teach our capstone course on crime prevention and policy. So all of these courses are areas in which we talk about Black Lives Matter and just really the larger issues that Black Lives Matter represents right now, right? These are not new issues, but they really come back to decisions that are made within the criminal justice system. So oftentimes I use this as an opportunity to teach students what the justice system really is, because there's a lot of misunderstanding about what happens in the justice system. And I hope that they leave and they graduate with a sense of the complexity of these social issues in which both practitioners and people that they interact with come together in these like very important decision-making scenarios called micro situations. And they can have lots of different outcomes that can greatly impact somebody's life in the future, maybe even their liberty, maybe even their own life. So I think that making students aware of that is really important. We talk about what's happening outside of the four walls of the classroom all the time. So I look forward to continuing this discussion today and this morning, and I will pass it over to Lakeisha.
Hi, my name is Dr. Lakeisha Meyer. I am the Assistant Dean of Academic Services sophomores and upper class students, and also the Coordinator of Disabilities Support Services here at Lycoming. I just started here in January, so I am still quite new to the institution, so an interesting first semester for me here. So as I think about these issues, I spent a lot of time thinking, excuse me, about some of my prior teaching and research, but also I think it's probably more important for me to point out that my identity, I view my identity, my personal identity, or maybe more so the intersection of my identities, as giving me a very unique kind of vantage point to examine some of these issues. And so that has created the interest in especially education. So I've spent a lot of time teaching. I've taught college level courses for over 20 years in areas of education, school psychology, primarily training individuals who want to work with young people either in K-12 schools or college as counselors, school teachers, student affairs professionals. And so I'm of the opinion that there are some professions and fields that demand not just the absence of discrimination and prejudice, but the active dismantling of systematic racism. And so Black Lives Matter movement has brought attention to that. For me personally, growing up as a Black woman in a very small, predominantly white rural town in Kentucky, first generation my family go to college, but also the first generation in my family that didn't experience segregated schools. And I feel like that's something that's really hard for some people to process. In part, yeah, so how is it that I can be the first generation of my family that wasn't forced to go at some point in their lives to segregated schools? And so these issues are not ancient history. And so I feel like Black Lives Matter movement has brought issues to the surface that we've been aware of for a really long time, that Black folks have been aware of for a really long time. And so for me, how that plays out in my work and research in the past, I've written some book chapters and research articles primarily addressing things related to cultural competence and assessment, working with youth with emotional and behavioral challenges, culturally competent ways. Also, how do we address some of the mental health needs of adults using tools that are grounded and rooted in those cultures of those individuals. And then also more recently, had the opportunity to do some work on the experiences of women of color in higher education. And so all of those issues provide an opportunity to point out or highlight how we can better serve people of color in those areas. And then in terms of what I'm doing now, in my current role, I only teach a couple of classes, but I do teach a leadership course for our Lycoming Summer Academy and also our academic resource skills course. And in both of those, I've started incorporating leadership and its role in social change. So I previously taught a leadership course, and in that course, we talk about social movements. How do you apply your leadership skills to impacting change in your society or community? And what's interesting to me is the Black Lives Matter movement is a movement that now students bring up as an example when I ask for examples of social movements. And that's not something that I would have thought when, after Trayvon Martin was murdered and this movement kind of started. And so I'm just glad to see the awareness, but also a little infuriated that it's taken so long for some people, that some folks required video footage to wake up to it. But I'm still glad that we are where we are at this point, and look forward to this conversation as well. So Sarah, I think.
Thanks. I'm Sarah Silke. I'm professor of history. I teach modern American history and African American women's history and the history of Africa. And so most of my teaching and research focuses on race relations, social justice movements, and reform networks. So in my courses, one of the things that I bring to them that comes from my research is an understanding of the historical cultural narratives that have been created in American society to try to justify systemic inequalities and racism. Even the foundations of the American dream itself, the mythology surrounding it, are used to try to shore up the existing system. And so I try to work with my students to uncover where these narratives come from, how they are developed and shifted and altered over time, how they evolve to be present in our society today. Many of my specialist courses deal with social justice movements in particular. I have a course on the Black Power movement, and Black Lives Matter has been a topic in my courses since the beginning of the movement in 2013. And I've incorporated into our discussions to look at the trajectory of where many of these arguments and debates and concerns are playing out today. In my research, I have looked at anti-lynching activism in my first book project, particularly the kinds of narratives that were used to justify racial oppression, and also the narratives that were put forward to try to address those issues and try to restore some balance. And I see a lot of continuity between the issues faced by African Americans at the end of the 19th century and our current criminal justice system, our current levels of income inequality and wealth inequality in this nation. And so I think by trying to help students understand the ways in which these systems and processes have been formed and evolved over time, it helps them to be able to better understand what steps we might need to take now to try to unravel them and dismantle them. So I would be happy to turn this back over to Chip if you wanted to get the discussion going.
Yes, great. Sorry, I started to talk and it was just so eloquent and I was on mute. So my apologies.
It happens to all of us.
Yes. Sarah, thank you for your introduction, and thank you all for talking about your work and the intersections with Black Lives Matter. And to sort of pick up on that theme, what I heard and what we heard a lot in your comments was really about social movements, this particular one, but then also connecting them to other broader social movements and how those have been sort of part of our history as a nation. And we have a really, I think, important question here that has come from our attendees. And the question that's being asked by Jim is, what is the distinction between the BLM movement and the formal organization calling itself Black Lives Matter? So if I can unpack that, I think it's a great question, but unpack it a little bit more is, a formal organization versus then how it starts to sort of act and be can sort of take different forms in this case, but perhaps in many social movements. So, I will kick it back to you to maybe start. If you want to provide any maybe historical context first, Sarah, and then others, if you'd be willing to weigh in on this question as well.
So one of the big question marks that's been surrounding the Black Lives Matter movement from its early stages is that the movement itself was designed to be decentralized. And in that respect, a lot of people have struggled to understand what it is and who's running it. They're looking for specific leaders. They think back to the civil rights movement of the 1960s, and they think like, well, where's today's Martin Luther King that's leading this movement? Not understanding that the civil rights movement was not led by Martin Luther King. He was somebody who provided some articulation of the vision of how American society could be reconstructed in a more just and inclusive way, dealing with a lot of different issues. But he was not the person who called all the shots. The civil rights movement was successful because of the growth of large grassroots organizing across the nation that involved activism and protest and legal challenges and a variety of different efforts in small communities and large communities across the nation. And it was that collective force of public activism that finally made some of the social pressure to start addressing these things on a larger scale. And so the Black Lives Matter movement today is diffuse and broad, and probably other people could speak a little bit more to that as well, but it has a different kind of form. It's not something that you're necessarily a card-carrying member of, and the leadership within local branches are constantly evolving as people step forward, when they have the energy and the skill set to be able to take a leadership role and then step back to allow others to fill in behind them, to be able to keep the momentum and the energy moving. So there's the broader movement for Black Lives, the Black Lives Matter movement, the organization Black Lives Matter, and loose coalitions of people who are sympathetic to the arguments that they're putting forward that are also being organized.
Thank you, Sarah. Others, Victoria, looks like you're ready to chime in.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, Sarah certainly covered a lot of ground. But one of the things that I've seen in my research that is so common, I think it's so interesting, is that when people are looking at movements that have started out online and are consistently developing online in conjunction with face-to-face protests, we're dealing with a very different kind of social movement than we have before. And even, there are some people that have been quoted as saying, I can't remember exactly who it was, saying like, this is not your grandmother's social movement, right? So there are a lot of people that are looking for, vestiges of the civil rights movement in how Black Lives Matter is organizing, and they're not seeing it. And through this comparison, they're sort of saying, okay, so but where's the nonviolent protest? There's almost this narrative of respectability politics that gets laden upon Black Lives Matter. And so I think, what some people do is they end up creating this binary. So who's in the organization versus who's organizing almost unofficially. But I think, as Sarah really identified, it is so diffuse and not leaderless, but leaderful, right? You have, various organizations throughout the country. I think that there's even Black Lives Matter in an organization in Canada. And that's how diffuse it is. And it's intended for that purpose. Part of the original intention of Black Lives Matter as being an organization developed by 3 women was that you can take this model and you can apply it to a whole range of other issues. As a matter of fact, like I think I mentioned, talking about briefly about intersectional injustices, some of the intention was, the intention was not just specifically to address, injustices and with the police and violence, but it was also to talk about, okay, there are more people being targeted than just African Americans here. It's like African Americans who are also LGBTQ, right? African Americans who are women, people in the prison system, right? People who are ex-felons, or not ex-felons, excuse me, people who have been labeled felons, right? Who are criminal offenders, right? So how do we take all of these people and address these injustices in one movement? And I think it's very difficult to do that. And that's why Black Lives Matter has evolved the way that it is, so that you can't really point to an organization and say, like, this is the organization that's trying to, formally work in the government for policy change, but rather you need to look to all of these informal organizations for their various and sometimes very specific and narrow issues that they're addressing in their own state and local, positions.
Thank you, Victoria. Anyone else want to chime in on that question?
Yeah, actually, if you don't mind, I had a couple of thoughts about that. I mean, I think what Victoria and Sarah are saying are absolutely true. And I think one of the things that I see in criminal justice is this evolving, right? So it started out as a response to events that were happening in 2012, 2013, and people were fed up. And I think that it was I always get so entrenched in these discussions with people about systematic racism, right? And criminal justice, and is that a real thing or not? And I'll get to that in just a second, but this was a response to things that were happening around the country involving police-led violence and injustices that were happening within the criminal justice system across the criminal justice system, not just with police, but also with in the courts, in sentencing, in prisons. And people were really fed up with it. They were fed up with it before, but I think that the online vehicle gave them a platform on which to kind of coalesce around and have their voices be heard. And so the response, I think, is often like, well, there isn't necessarily systematic racism. They're just bad apples in the criminal justice system, and there's just bad police. But we talk about this in class with students, in my policing class, where if you're seeing, yeah, maybe there are bad apples, right? And there probably are. But if a bunch of bad apples are around the country, or if we get rid of the bad apples and more bad apples appear in policing, then it really speaks to more of a bad barrel and maybe even a bad orchard that has kind of created, and some people are experiencing the effects of that, and other people are not. And so I think it's really hard to get some of my students who never really had an issue with the criminal justice system or police, and they don't understand it. And so it's really interesting conversations that we have within class. And I can see sometimes where students are like, all right, it is not just about bad police officers. It's a cultural or a systemic issue that is much bigger than just one individual police officer and one individual incident. So I think, to kind of get back to the question, I think it's evolving as well, right? So I think that the movement is started as one thing, and now it's coalescing around kind of these larger and larger issues as we kind of like realize, whoa, it's a barrel or a bad orchard that we're kind of dealing with, and it's not just one institution itself.
Please go ahead. Lakeisha, please go ahead.
Yeah, that does actually make me think a couple of things that folks have said. I liked the leaderful, not leaderless comment. I can't shake that one. And it made me think about, as Justin was talking about the expansiveness of the movement. And for me, it's as if highlighting it in the area of related to police brutality. Yes, that's Black Lives Matter has brought attention to the disparities that exist there, but also beyond that, to the point that folks are like, oh, is it the society, not bad apples, not a barrel, not an orchard, but the fact that these disparities can result in death for things like the whole, it can be deathly dangerous to blink while Black, jog, sleep, shop, help me, right? The list could go on and on. And so the fact that this movement has expanded to address really almost every area of life that these disparities can exist in, so that folks are more aware that when Black women go to the doctor, are they less likely to get pain medication because they're not heard by their physicians, or when in schools, when I worked in K-12 schools, students who were Black could get harsher consequences for the exact same misbehavior, disproportionate representation in anything that has poor outcomes, and overrepresented in anything that has poor outcomes, underrepresented if it's positive. So fewer Black students in gifted and talented, more labeled as EBD and segregated separate classrooms. So it's just, for me, these are things that I feel like some of us have been like banging our head against the wall saying, do you see this, what's happening? And now that folks, I feel like people are actually seeing and believing it. It's, as I said before, it's frustrating that it has taken some of the things to get us to this point, like actually seeing video, and even that's not enough for some folks. And so the idea that this has created this very expansive awareness of what the Black experience is like in this country. It's amazing to see, but also sometimes hard to process.
I'll just follow up. Lakeisha, you so nicely articulated some of the things I was thinking. And there is a Black Lives Matter at School movement that was started, I think, in 2018. And it's kind of what everyone has been saying. It's these offshoots and realizing how important this is in our society. I think they have three main goals, and it is to, have some focus on what we refer to as the school to prison pipeline, some of those discrepancies between how we respond to students' misbehavior, for lack of a better term, and how students of color tend to be more harshly punished. The Black Lives Matter at School movement focuses on looking at standards and curriculum to teach students, regardless of where they are, about diverse backgrounds. And I think another very important part that they're focusing on is getting more teachers of color in the classroom. We have so few teachers of color, and so many students are not able to see themselves represented in that classroom and setting, and that's just not fair to children growing up. So just an example of how things connect.
Thank you all. That was wonderful. And Jim, a really, really great question that clearly, I think, opened up this discussion quite well. As we think about this particular movement and what has come out of this, or where there's been pushback or backlash, is this notion of, well, yes, but don't all lives matter? Don't blue lives matter? Of course, all lives do matter, but maybe we could, speak to this. And some will often say, well, really, I've gotten to a point in my life where I'm really colorblind. And while I think each of us can see the merits or the sentiments that are involved in that, in leaning in that direction, but maybe that might be an interesting one, I think, to unpack a little bit here together, if you're willing. But why is this distinctive? Why is it too quick to jump to some of these other ways of framing what does matter? And and perhaps this notion of that is out there being colorblind, and the statement that, well, haven't we moved to a point where we should or can be colorblind? And anybody open to picking up that thread and maybe talking about that a little bit? Sarah, I see you nodding. You want to start?
Sure. So I have a couple of thoughts that I'm sure everybody else is going to be able to build off of as well. I want to start with first the why Black Lives Matter, and thinking about the history of violence against Black people in this country, and how that has been used as a way of demonstrating for the past 150, 200, 350, 400 years that African Americans have no actual value. They don't have rights. They don't have the same status in American society as white people do. And so there's no expectations that the killings of Black people are going to be prosecuted. And if we look at part of America's more recent but dark past, with the phenomenon of lynching in American society, which claimed the lives of thousands of individuals in our country. These were mob murders that were conducted in broad daylight by people who were known within the community to be often leaders within the community. Police officers were often involved. The criminal justice system turned a blind eye to these murders. Some of these were done as large-scale spectacle events where people were announced in advance that this was going to happen, and people came out to watch while individuals were tortured and murdered. And those events made a very, very clear message to the Black community that their lives had zero value. And when you have that as a starting point in our society, just because we got through the civil rights movement and we started unraveling some of the legal restrictions that kept African Americans in a second-class citizenship status in our country, doesn't mean that that underlying message really went away. A lot of the violence against African Americans was driven underground rather than being something that was on full display. And so if we think about the violence against civil rights activists in the 1950s and 1960s, some we had public executions of, public assassinations, but many others just were disappeared and were not found again. And even when Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman disappeared, the civil rights activists disappeared in Mississippi, when they went to try to find the bodies, when the FBI finally came in to try to find them, they ended up dredging up the bodies of almost a dozen African-American men, only 2 of whom they ever identified. So the number of murders that went without any kind of punishment has a long standing history and legacy in this country. And so when individuals are saying that Black Lives Matter, they're saying that they need to matter as much as everyone else is. And so that all lives matter phrase is a way of erasing and ignoring that history of violent oppression in our society. Just as trying to be colorblind is, for people who say that they don't see color, it means that they don't see the full lived reality of the people around them. It's ignoring the experiences and the diverse experiences that people bring to our society. It also discourages them from looking to have more diverse perspectives in the room. Decision-making is always more effective when you have multiple perspectives coming together in the room. And if you block people from being able to get into the room to have a voice, then you're going to be in a little bubble, a little echo chamber that's going to lead us in directions that isn't going to result in the best outcomes. So I want to pass that off. I know I just said a whole bunch, but I think other people have great contributions to make to this.
Thank you, Sarah. Victoria, I think I saw your hand. And
Yeah, you know, and just to follow Sarah again, I mean, I think like that was a really amazing way to enter into this conversation because it gives us a lot of context here. And the one thing that I think struck me the most is sort of this consideration of value, the value of the life of an African American person. I've actually been thinking a lot about this in my own work and in my teaching. When I first started, I used to take the position that the system that we're living in is broken, right? That the criminal justice system is broken, the legal system is broken, you know, and, you know, Lakeisha said something in her intro that struck me as true for me as well, right? That, you know, my own identities come into play here when I'm thinking about these things as well. So growing up, you know, a Puerto Rican kid in Queens, you know, I got to see all of these ways in which the system did not serve, you know, the Black and brown people that I was surrounded with on a regular basis. And so when I was teaching, I used to come at it with this, okay, like this is broken, how do we fix it? The more that I've done research and the more that I've sort of engaged in conversations with my students, I've realized it's not that the system is broken. It's not that we're not placing value on people's lives. It's that the value that has been placed on an African American community for so long is the value of a scapegoat, right? There's value there. There's value in having a community of people that we can look to and say, you are less than, and your purpose is to serve as workers or to sort of take the blame for the things that are wrong with us. And you know, again, so now I'm coming at it from the system is not broken, but the system was not built to fit with this community. It was not built to provide this community with the access to rights, resources, opportunities, etc. The same of everyone else, whatever that means, right? You know, the system was not built for equality, therefore it's not broken. It's just, you know, it kind of makes me think about what Justin said, you know, it's not, you know, bad apples. It's not, you know, a bad branch on a tree. This might be just a bad orchard situation, right? And I think that if we consider it this way, that our system was not built to align with, you know, equality for all of these underrepresented populations, then what do, right? Because it's not something that can be fixed necessarily. It's something that requires a whole new system, a whole new way of thinking. And I think the whole concept of being colorblind plays into this as well, because it's an understanding where, okay, if we fix these certain things, if we tweak this here and there, then I can say, oh, look, I don't see color. I accept everyone. I welcome everyone into my house. I don't see it. And therefore, you know, as Sarah, you know, started to say, then you're not recognizing the experience. You know, there was one thing that I heard recently that was so interesting, that part of this whole idea of being colorblind is, oh, now we're all starting at the same, you know, mile marker. Now we're all at the same starting point. But you can't say that you're starting at the same starting point if one person starts, you know, now, and then the next person starts, you know, 300 years later, right? You know, same starting point, but you're behind. You're never going to catch up, right? So being colorblind would basically be saying like, oh, look, we can do the same things now. You know, now it's all about merit. It's not about who you are and who your identity is. But, you know, there's a whole, you know, I guess there's a lot of literature right now that actually goes into how being colorblind is a form of racism. I believe it was Eduardo Bonilla Silva who wrote a whole book on colorblind racism, just how it's almost like a willful unseeing of all of the systematic things that have happened in our society over time that have led to where we are now. And I'm sure there's lots of people that can chime in on this as well, but that's just all I was thinking.
Go ahead, Justin.
Yeah, I mean, these are very, everything is just so thoughtful and articulate. And I really appreciate these conversations. And I think one contribution that I think about when I think about Black Lives Matter is a part of it is just trying to get people to recognize that there are like two Americas and two experiences that are lived. And part of what the message is, I think, is just a recognition that people are living a different life. They experience the interactions with government and with healthcare in a totally different way. And so I think when we talk about colorblind, you're erasing that, right? You're essentially erasing those kind of distinctions, very similar to, I think, what Sarah and Victoria were trying to say. And I totally agree with that. So I get in my classes a lot, kind of to bring it back to, you know, a classroom experience and how we can talk about these things. You know, I get maybe, well, there's things like Black on Black violence, which I don't like that term anyway, but, you know, that's brought up, or police kill white people too. And that's true, right? Police, if police are killing people, that should cause us to stop and think, all of us, to think about what's going on. But aside from that point, right, we can look at the disproportionality. And I think, you know, Rachel, you were talking about school to prison pipeline. We think about zero tolerance types of policies that get applied to one group and the other group doesn't experience those things. So there's a disproportionality that affects Black and brown people from the moment that the interaction starts. They're more likely to be in contact with police. They're more likely to be pulled over. They're more likely to be arrested. They're more likely to experience force by police. You know, they're more likely to have more severe sentences. Just all the way through the justice system, we can see this disproportionality. And I think once you see that, you start to see that the experience that somebody has is completely different from perhaps your own. And I like having those moments in class and seeing where it goes. And I'm gonna stop there, but those were kind of my thoughts about that.
And if I could, I'll just jump in real quick. I wanted to follow up on both of what Victoria and Justin said. You know, I think, Victoria, you're so right in that, oh gosh, now I just lost my train of thought. Let me go back to what Justin was saying. Then, you know, when we talk about school to prison pipeline, we think even at preschool, 3 to 5 year old children, the rate of children being disciplined harshly, children of color being suspended from preschool. When we talk about what's developmentally typical and normal, and we think of maybe what might be referred to as a temper tantrum or something. And so to suspend them and not to be talking about how could you handle this situation in a better way, in what way did, what did you want to happen, and why did you want that to happen, and how did you respond, and how could we do that differently next time? But instead, we're suspending, we are essentially kicking out of school these 3 to 5 year olds. And so it starts then, and then it continues on through the school system, this same behavior between students, but they are handled vastly different. And now I remember what I was going to say about Victoria. You were talking about the origins of things and how they get started in the system. And if we look back at the start of the education system in our country, it was set up for affluent white males. And so I think we really need to start thinking about that as well. How do we revise our school systems so that we're meeting the needs of all of our learners?
Yeah,
Go
if I
ahead,
could,
Leticia, yeah.
thank you. So I have so many thoughts running through my mind right now. It's really hard to kind of pull them all together. This is really wonderful. Rachel, what you were just saying about our education system and kind of why it was created. My interest in education and many of the things that and although I don't exclusively focus on issues of diversity, that's really just kind of a side because of who I am as a person. Most of my research and work is not explicitly related to that. And in fact, I have not felt that I could address those issues in the same way as some of my white peers could in the classroom. And so that has been a challenge as well, to be presenting as a Black woman, but bringing up those issues, having to choose very carefully how to do that, when to do that, at least in the different, some of the places that I've worked. But in terms of education, we think about, okay, who was our education system created to provide education to? I think about how, all people say, well, all men are created equal. It's in our, well, we just redefined what a man was to make it fit. Like, how is that? So when folks were like, well, our country was founded on these basic principles. Well, in order to make it such that Black people didn't have to be treated equally, we decided they were less than a whole man. And some folks don't, there's this trust of the system and of the kind of the institutions in our country that people have them because they've never experienced being and sometimes traumatized by those systems or institutions. And so the fact that my grandparents didn't get to go to school at all, and my mom didn't get to go to integrated school until she was a freshman in high school. Granted, that was in 1964 because they were a little slow to integrate in Hart County. So even then, when the law was passed, it's not as if everyone suddenly started providing equal access in terms of education. It took many years for those changes to take place. And so for me, my experience has been one of feeling like I'm invisible and under a microscope at the same time. So feeling and wanting to talk about these issues in every class and seeing a connection in every class I've ever taught, in every session I've ever done for almost anything, I can find a way to connect it to issues of race, because that's my lived experience. But also, I view myself as, I saw this phrase recently, I am my ancestors' wildest dream. And when I think about like education like that, I love education. I work in a university, college, because I never wanted to leave school. That's mainly why I'm here. I just wanted to be a student forever, so I figured I would do this. But the idea that, now I lost my train of thought. But when I think about, for me, why I've started actually more actively incorporating these issues, I decided that I needed to be more authentic when I talked about issues related to race and diversity after Trayvon Martin was murdered. And so the same thing that sparked the Black Lives Matter movement was a complete shift in my world professionally and personally, but especially professionally, I started finding ways to write about my experience in my work. So having a chapter about the experiences of women of color in higher ed, that came about as a result really of something I experienced at the institution I was working at when Trayvon Martin was murdered. And so for me, I have sometimes tried to almost deny the impact of some racism and discrimination has had in my life. So when I was younger, I said, I'm a member of the human race. I went through that period in my racial identity development where I wanted to believe that we were all one. And, but yet when I walked out into the street and was jogging and someone was throwing beer cans and yelling the N-word, knowing nothing about me, absolutely just by sight, I infuriated them and filled them with so much hate and rage that they lashed out just by the sight of me. And that was, so I can't deny that these disparities exist, that racism is real. And so personally though, bringing these issues into the classroom or when I'm meeting with the students, so I've also started helping students think about how can they combine their interest in their academics and activism, because I'm trying to figure out how to do that myself. And so modeling that for students, I think is important. And so even in my one-on-one meetings that are more about academic support, sometimes students bring up issues that are relevant to these, the things we're talking about today. And they are trying to figure out how to manage the emotional burden of some of those things and get their classwork done. And I get that. I understand that, even doing this work as a professional and balancing the impact that, okay, I get pulled over one day and my daughter's in the car with me and she breaks down crying because she's afraid I'm going to die. That happened relatively recently. And yet, wherever we're on our way to, we get out of the car and we're moving along like we're just, moving about our day. When we literally just being pulled over created this very emotional experience for us. And so balancing the energy that's required to manage that, I think is sometimes a challenge. But yeah, sorry, kind of rambling here now a little bit.
If I could just follow up really quickly on something you said, Lakeisha. I mentioned a little bit ago about the Black Lives at School movement, and one of their goals is to have more teachers of color and how important that is. And, I think we all know as teachers that building relationships with our students is the most valuable thing in the classroom for so many reasons. But just what you said about building relationships and talking about your experiences as a Black woman with your students is so valuable. As you were talking, I was recalling a talk I heard by Rich Milner, who's at Vanderbilt University and does a lot of work on urban education and Black Lives Matter connected to school. And he was talking about just observing a classroom where there was a third grade male teacher who was a Black man. And just as part of the normal classroom, the students were talking about, the day before we were walking home from school and we were in the park and these cops came up to so-and-so and he was able, this young teacher was able to stop and say, this has happened to me. And they were just able to talk about this in a way that I wouldn't be able to talk with my students about. And so I just wanted to add that. I think it's so important to have that relationship and that role.
Thank you all. I think, again, to sort of pick up on a theme is that what's being, I think, unpacked here is a desire to listen and to understand. And just because we don't experience something doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Just because we don't have a mother who suffers from Alzheimer's doesn't mean Alzheimer's doesn't exist. And just because we don't lose someone to cancer doesn't mean cancer doesn't exist. And so how is it, I think that some of this visceral response to this on both sides is, well, I don't see myself as part of the problem, and perhaps maybe that's the wrong framing. Maybe it isn't about how I am or am not a part of the problem, but maybe the better question is, how do I become part of the solution? And so, maybe we could talk about that a little bit. And just because we haven't yet experienced it, personally or through other connections, how do we better understand it? I mean, part of what learning is at its best is exploring things that we really don't yet understand or haven't experienced, and then try and contextualize that through our own experiences. So, how is it that those listening today, and how we might invite and encourage others to better understand and to be more part of the solution? Go ahead, Justin.
Yeah, thanks. That just inspired me and made me think of something. So over this past summer, I've been consulting unofficially with some people in Williamsport, the mayor of Williamsport and the chief of police, and working on some of their reforms and what they want to do in the city. And they're very interested in listening to and addressing concerns that residents in Williamsport have specifically. But what I wanted to say was that what you said really reminded me of something. And I think I always want to focus on being part of solutions, right? And focusing on what kind of changes people can make. And I have to say personally, I'm so impressed with Gen Z. And I think that their ability to kind of see through and cut through some of the things that people really hadn't addressed or wanted to ignore or just pretend like it didn't existed. I think Gen Z, the students that are in our classes right now, they see past that, right? And they recognize it and they call it what it is. And so working with the mayor, he told me this story, this anecdote, and I hope he's okay with me sharing this. But he told me this anecdote about one of the marches that happened in Williamsport. And some of the young leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement that were organized here in Williamsport, they held several rallies, marches, and protests in the city over the summer. And he started kind of talking to those leaders who are, 18, 19, 20 years old. And they really had no idea how to make these changes, right? They wanted to kind of scream in the streets and get their voice out. And he said, the way that you make a change is that you start thinking about the policy and you start thinking about the laws and you start thinking about what are the things that are creating the systems that you don't want to see anymore, right? And he was basically saying, get involved and teaching them how to run for things like city council, 18, 19-year-olds. How do you position yourself to get on a ballot as a mayor of a place? And I think that was really, really fantastic to hear. Thinking about how can you be a part of the solution? Well, you go to the root of that problem and you change it. So I was very encouraged, and I'm still encouraged to kind of see what's going to come of that with this younger generation who I think will go out and do some of these changes that we're talking about today.
I'll just add, I always think from an education perspective, and because reading and reading specialist is my background, the power of literature is so valuable. And so we talk in my classes about, as a teacher, no matter where you teach, if you are teaching in a school that is completely white, it is your responsibility to be reading high quality literature with diverse characters in, and to be showing that we all have similar human nature. We all think and feel and act in similar ways, and we need to celebrate the differences that we have. So I think literature can be a very powerful tool for starting to teach young children to celebrate differences among peers and among our society, and that even though we do have differences, there are a lot of similarities in how we think and act and feel.
Go ahead, Lakeisha, and then Victoria.
So I was thinking about how I think you asked kind of how do we get, when I think about how do we get people to kind of listen to me and hear my perspective. So if there's something that they don't think exists because they haven't experienced it, like white privilege, for example, when I've done, a workshop or seminar on something related to microaggressions and privilege, I have found that for me, I almost have to, rather than present how I've been a part of the solution, it's almost as if I have to point out have experienced privilege before I can get the white person I'm talking to acknowledge theirs. And so I have spent some time thinking about that. And so I view myself as having educational privilege, for example. Like there are, in part because of where I ended up, but also because when I was in elementary school, I did very well on a standardized test, which defies many stereotypes and other things, but and was placed in gifted and talented. And as a result, in rural Kentucky, I got to use computers in the 4th grade, which were not available to anyone else in our entire county. We took trips. I went to New York City when I was in middle school. And these are things that in my rural area, no other kids had access to other than this very small group of students who were tapped by how they scored on this one test. And that gave me opportunities and access. And as a result, there are things that are easier for me to gain access to. That is a form of privilege. And so it's almost, I have found that it's strange. I can't come across as too in order for people to hear me in certain environments, it's almost like I have to bring myself down a notch. And I resent that a little bit, but also understand that some people need to know that if I'm saying that they're privileged, and they're thinking, what do you don't even, how can you say that about me? I haven't experienced that. But I feel like when I'm able to say privilege is something that can exist in lots of ways and lots of areas. For some people that is around race, and for others it may be other things, financial, because or whatever that thing is. And so I've always struggled with how do I position myself, especially when I'm in front of the classroom. Because typically, if that's been the case, the students I'm looking at and I'm teaching have been mostly white throughout my entire experience, educational experiences and teaching experiences. So for me as a Black woman standing in front of the classroom, I have sometimes maybe felt like I need to be very careful about how I approach these topics. So if I want someone to believe something that I feel in my heart is so true, how can it be denied? But I can't say it I can't just put it out there in that way. And so I now feel like the environment has changed enough that I feel safer expressing what I really believe and feel. And that has been a long time coming. And I don't know, maybe it says more about me and my kind of insecurities throughout my previous years than it does the kind of society and culture. But there does seem to be a general level of understanding and support that certain acts and behaviors are bad, that I haven't seen kind of historically in the past. Also, I was thinking about how different events will trigger kind of movements, and for me, my experiences have been very much connected to my educational trajectory, but transitioning from high school to college was when the LA riots, Rodney King, and all of that was happening. And so that, and then over time, other events and things have occurred that have sparked like Trayvon Martin's murder, but then also just but the frequency of those and the number of innocent Black folks who were being killed, the number of times we were seeing Black bodies being harmed, I started to worry that folks were actually getting desensitized to that. So rather than it having the positive impact that I thought it was, I start to worry that now are we just getting used to seeing Black people die? And so I'm curious to know what, especially from those of you that really research this, this is your work, kind of what are so I'm kind of asking a question, I guess, of my peers in terms of Do other folks see, what are the things we should look out for in terms of pitfalls to avoid as things continue to grow and develop? Is there a desensitization that's happening? How do we make sure that things stay relevant and real for folks? It's one of the things I'm thinking about.
Thanks, Lakeisha. Well, maybe that's a question we want to sort of go back to the panel with Victoria. I know you were, I don't know if you had a prior thread you wanted to pick up on, but then maybe we can kind of go to that additional question from Lakeisha.
Yeah, absolutely. I was gonna, chime in on, some of the experiences that I have in the classroom, but before, I mean, maybe, just so that I don't forget, I feel like I'm all scattered. I know, Lakeisha, you're like a million different things. That's how I'm feeling right now. But one of the things when you were asking the question, Lakeisha, that came to my mind was a talk by Kimberly Crenshaw all about intersectionality. And one of the most striking things that she did, and it's something that I reproduce in my own classroom, was that she started off by having everybody in the audience stand up. And, and she was going to read a list of names, and for every name that, someone didn't recognize, someone in the audience had to sit down. So started out with the names of, many of the men who had been shot and killed. And it was, Trayvon Martin, Eric Gardner, et cetera. The names that we could list for on and on. And most of the people were still standing at this point. And then she went on and started listing the names of women that have been killed by police around that same time. And by the end of that list, everybody was sitting down because we did not recognize those names. And one of the things that I think is so interesting and ties into this is, Kimberly Crenshaw said that we don't have frames for how to either report about or understand these issues, right? We have a very identifiable frame to understand police violence against Black men. We don't have an active frame for how to understand police violence against Black women. So I'm wondering if some of whatever we're experiencing with desensitization that I'm seeing in my students too, is maybe just we do not have the available, or students don't have the available frames to process all of this, right? We don't have a central location where we can go and really get reliable and accessible, information about it. I will do the same things in my classes periodically as I hear about these events that happen. Did you hear about this? Did you hear about this person being killed? Did you hear about this event? And more, it's more like, no. We're like, no, I didn't hear about that. Oh, it's just like everything else. I've actually heard a student say that. It's just like everything else that's happened. One could argue that this is very similar to, at some point, school shootings, right? It was like school shooting after school shooting. I was like, oh, which one is that now? And I'm not trying to be glib in order to, say that this isn't important. I think it's really important, the extent to which I think we're almost facilitating that desensitization, through the media and even through some of the conversations that we're having with our students. So just to backtrack, I don't want to take too long for a second, but one of the things that Justin said that struck me is, about like Gen Z. Like I'm on board with having hope for Gen Z. I think that they're going to do some really interesting things. But one of the things that I've been seeing in my experiences in classes right now is that the biggest hurdle that I get for coming up with, potential solutions or moving forward in discussions about race, racism, privilege, etc., is bias, right? Is a lot of students come in with this inability to recognize their own bias. I almost think of it as like there's two kinds. I think we talk about implicit bias on a regular basis, and now I'm seeing evidence of complicit bias. Sometimes people don't recognize their bias and they're going about being like, oh, I didn't know. But then even once they know, they're like, oh, it's not an issue for me because I don't act on it, right? Or it's not an issue for me. I'm not actually like that. So even when they're confronted with their own bias, there's this inability to navigate what that means or how it plays out in their day-to-day experiences. So I think in terms of solutions, even for kids of younger generations now, I mean, part of the source of our bias is socialization. It's the things that we learn from our families and friends, and even from, selective media intake, right? Because I think we can all sort of see that, the media that we're accessing on a regular basis, none of it is going to be, like I said, consistent, reliable, always giving us, a very objective perspective. So if we have all of these biases building up and building up, building up over time, you know, this part of what the solution needs to be is that we need to have consistent reflection about those biases. We need to have a re-examination. And even I tell my students all the time, my role here in the classroom is to build a community, but it won't be a comfortable community. And they look at me like I'm nuts. And I'm basically saying that in a class, particularly like race and ethnicity, although all of my classes I have this approach, right? We need to be uncomfortable in our unpacking of our own social positions and the biases that come with it. Because I think that's where real learning and growth comes. If you recognize your own positionality in the system, then you can understand the bigger system and how it plays out. So those were just my 2 cents on some of the things that people were talking about.
Thank you, Victoria. And Sarah, go ahead.
I was just going to add a couple of quick thoughts. One, absolutely, we have to become more comfortable with being uncomfortable. And that's really part of the key to moving forward and finding solutions, is to be able to accept that space and to recognize that even when we have, even when we need to recognize our own responsibility for helping to make things better, and that we need to take action to help make things better, that our revelations of our bias and our revelations of how the system is framed aren't necessarily personal attacks against us. I think a lot of people are very emotionally tied to an image of themselves as being fair-minded and accepting and all of this. And we need to recognize that we're raised within a culture. We're raised within our family culture, we're raised within our community culture, we're raised within a national culture. And if we don't recognize all this stuff on site, in part, that's because of design. I mean, we talked earlier about how the system of the United States in general is framed in a way to make inequality happen, right? That it has been a big part of it. And if we even think about our Constitution places limits on how we can make things unequal. And that has been used as a guide. People have worked very hard to try to frame many of the structures in colorblind language that is specifically prohibited by our laws. We can't have specific racial bias baked into, in a very overt way, the laws that we have. But because we have worked very hard and gotten very good at hiding it in colorblind language, it means that it's hard for us to see sometimes. And so we have to listen to the lived experiences of people who are on the other side of those interactions and those realities, to be able to recognize and better understand the implications of the way in which things are being handled and processed. And I think that for too long in this country, and this kind of comes out of the civil rights era of the 1960s, many people have tied racism to a very narrow definition that is focused on hearts and minds. It's if I have racist intent, if I have the intention of harming someone else, then I am a racist. But if I do things that harm somebody else because of power differentials, or because of playing into or even benefiting from a system that is designed to put me in a better position than someone who is not of my skin tone and of my background, people have a hard time accepting that that may be true, while they also do not intend to benefit from that at the same time, that that's not an intentional action of trying to cause someone else harm. And so we need to be able to be uncomfortable and work in that space where we can hear and listen to some of the realities of what is actually happening, rather than trying to internalize all of this as some kind of attack on ourselves. We have responsibility to try to make things better. We don't, that's not all about individual intent.
Thank you, Sarah. And you know, we're getting close to the hour here of 12:30, and you know, I think it could be a nice way to, as a final piece, what are you hearing from Lycoming students? What are you hearing in the classroom? And you know, Justin, you had a great remark earlier, just of the promise that you see in Gen Z and sort of cutting through and seeing, I mean, others, and maybe all of you, just how are you seeing this play out in the classroom, and what gives you hope and promise for tomorrow?
Can I jump in quick?
Please go ahead, Sarah.
One of the things that, in a weird way, gives me a lot of hope in working with my students these days is that I've noticed, so this is my 13th year teaching at Lycoming, and between when I started and now, I have to explain a lot more of the racism inherent in past scholarship and past interpretations. And I get into classes and they're like, I don't understand. Why would people think that Africans are less civilized or less developed than Europeans? It's like, thank you, yes, but the institution, the academy, the scholarship that we are engaging with, a lot of it is having to unpack past racism and history. Like, we don't get it, it's fine. Like, why would we think that? It's like, yes, but we also have to understand that these systems have been built into place and we need to, you know, recognize why people are trying to push back against this. So the fact that I have to explain more about the history of racism, the history of homophobia, the history of gender discrimination in my classes makes me feel very optimistic about what kind of progress we can make in the future.
Go ahead, Victoria.
Very quickly, I think that, you know, I've seen a lot of that too. You know, I've been teaching for maybe 6 years in a variety of institutions, and I see, you know, a lot of those same conversations, like why was this necessary, essentially, you know, students looking back at history and being like, people were ridiculous, you know, and that is kind of, it is inspiring a bit. I think, you know, where else I see hope is that, you know, there is more willingness to have conversations about things that in past classes I would have addressed and then maybe heard crickets, right? So maybe, you know, 6 years ago, 5 years ago, you know, even mentioning the word race, like let's say in my media culture and society class, you know, I'd have a lot of students be like, oh, do we have to talk about that here? You know, is this necessary? That, you know, it seems off topic. But in every class I teach now, I intentionally bring up race, and people can see the connections. People are like, oh yeah, you know, that makes sense why we would talk about it in, you know, gender and sexuality in, you know, a class about, you know, law. You know, that makes sense. So I see a lot of hope there, and I think that this translates into thinking about Black Lives Matter movement, because, you know, one of the things that was true for a number of years, so it started, you know, 7 years ago, and I think for 2 or 3 years there, even getting people to say Black Lives Matter was a struggle, right? It was almost a little taboo. Like, we don't, you know, a lot of politicians didn't want to even get on board, you know, just because they were like, okay, maybe this is just too divisive at this point. Right. And I think that we're seeing a time now where, you know, there's acknowledgement that this movement is needed, right? That it's necessary. And we've seen so much progress in that we have, you know, Black Lives Matter painted in bold letters on the street leading up to the White House. I mean, so I think that in a lot of ways, you know, there's many reasons to have hope, and Lycoming students are really, I think, showing that there has been progress, and there's a lot more progress, you know, to be made in our thinking and developing and moving towards potential solutions.
I'm also very hopeful as well. I don't have as much experience here at Lycoming yet, but I taught my first college level class in '98, and there are things at a time when talking about diversity meant one day of the semester. You know, it was the one chapter in the Ed Psych textbook. And what I see now is those issues being addressed more broadly throughout the kind of curriculum of really every subject area. And so that gives me a lot of hope. And when this summer I taught a leadership course, and we talk about their role in changing the communities that they're a part of and what positive change they want to make, it's not even it, like, that's, of course that's what they're going to do. Of course I'm going to get involved and change my community. And I want to make things that are like, it's almost as if what I'm asking, it's just such, it's an expectation. They expect to be, it's almost as if we are just a whole generation of little activists, not little, but activists. Like and that really that makes me excited to see that, that energy around change. Like that it's not viewed as something that is bad or is too difficult, just it may take time and it's not going to be easy all the time, but it's like they're ready. They just seem ready for it.
If I had several thoughts. I have lots of thoughts going through my head, but the one that I guess I want to just end with in terms of hope, I want to actually like pan out a little bit and just kind of think about like the things that we as a society are exposed to and consume. I think that younger people are going to experience television, movies, media in a different way that I think wouldn't necessarily exist 20 years ago. And it wouldn't exist, I don't think, without Black Lives Matter. And so I think we're going to have more of these conversations that you're, like Sarah, like you were saying, we're like, what were these people thinking? Like, of course, we want to see things that represent us, and we want to watch movies with people that look like us. Like, why was it never like that? And so I think we're going to have more of those conversations. So I think just kind of like a broader society, there's a lot more work to do, obviously. But I think just within the last 10 years, just kind of seeing that diversity in what's out there and consumable and what's kind of portrayed as heroes and in popular culture, I think has changed. And so that gives me a little bit of hope as well.
I'm not sure if anybody else has any final comments on that, but I'm mindful that we are just about at the hour, and with the level of engagement that we've had with each of the questions, I'm not sure that we could process another one between now and 12:30. But I will maybe just offer just a closing remark and then a thanks. And Amy, if it's okay, I'll speak a little bit on your behalf as well. But it is really a privilege to be part of a community of people who think so well and deeply about not just their own experiences, but how is it that we can delve more deeply into the experiences of others, and want to own and want to have them be part of how we see the world. And so if there's anything that I'm going to take away today, it is that. It's a celebration of what this movement means for us. It's a celebration of what this means for others. And so thank you for sharing in this event today. Thank you, Amy, for organizing and thinking so well about how we can do this together. And thank you for those who've joined us. And it is recorded, and we hope that this will be an ongoing resource for many of us over time. And for those who have individual questions or comments that you'd like to share back with us, please let us know. And we look forward to keeping this conversation going. Thank you.